Hello everyone. In this video I would like to spend some time talking about PHP tags, comments, and validation. So let's start off by talking about PHP tags themselves. You've seen some use of PHP tags in a few of my previous videos, but to just sort of run back through what we've seen already, PHP tags are most often used in the form where they start off with less than $PHP and then end with $greater than. So essentially a set of angle brackets with question marks just inside of them and then the letters PHP at the beginning. This is the most common type of PHP tag. They're sometimes referred to as long PHP tags, but they're also the most universally acceptable. They are enabled on virtually every PHP setup that you might happen to come across. So this is the type of PHP tag that I will actually be using in videos and that I actually most often use myself when I'm doing any kind of PHP work. The way they generally work is that we would put in a set of PHP tags like this, and then inside those PHP tags we can put in whatever PHP statements we might want to put in. The echo statement, for example, is the one that we've been using in previous examples and we'll keep using pretty extensively here for a little while just for example's sake. So I might say echo this is a test, and maybe I will include an HTML break tag in the output from that echo at that point. So this is a pretty common sort of use for PHP tags. The basic purpose, of course, for PHP tags is to give us a way to be able to make the PHP code in our files recognizable to the PHP compiler, the PHP server, so that it's easily able to tell the difference between the PHP code and anything else that may be present in our files, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and other types of code like that. It's important, of course, that the server be able to tell the difference between those different types of codes so that the server is able to unambiguously recognize which parts are PHP so that it knows which parts need to be executed as PHP. Everything then that isn't PHP, the server simply passes through. It doesn't attempt to execute it, it just includes it as it is in the actual output. Like I was saying, this is the most common type of PHP tag that's used. You may, however, occasionally see short tags used. PHP short tags would look just like the regular tag that I used a moment ago, except it would be missing the PHP letters after the beginning of the tag. A lot of people like these short tags. Obviously, it saves you from having to type PHP at the beginning of each one of these sets of tags, so that's a bit of an advantage. The disadvantage of the short tags, however, is that they are not universally available. It's possible to configure a PHP server to recognize both the regular tags and the short tags, but not every server is set up that way. Not every server is configured to be able to recognize and use the short tags. If it's your own server on your own computer, then it's certainly a configuration option you can go in and turn on easily enough. But if you were working in, say, a shared hosting environment where you weren't actually in control of the configuration of the PHP server, there's the possibility that these short tags may simply not be available to you, which is why I generally don't use them. Nothing more frustrating than going through building a project on my development computer where maybe I've allowed myself the use of the short tags, only to find out that when I then try to deploy to an actual production server that the short tags are unavailable and I have to go back through my code and convert everything back to the normal tags. So while these short tags are here, while they are a possibility, while you might see them used occasionally, I generally don't recommend them because they are not as truly universal as the regular tags are. When we're actually writing our PHP tags, we have the option in our PHP scripts, like this one that I've already created called tagsexample.php. We have the example in these files to use as many different sets of PHP tags as we might happen to need. So here, for example, of course, I've already put in one set of regular PHP tags where I'm echoing out the text, "This is a test," followed by a break. If I wanted to, I could certainly go and put in other sets of PHP tags without any problem. I could say, "This is another test," and maybe I'll put another break tag after that. When we are actually writing our PHP tags, not only can we put in as many different copies of them or as many different sets of the PHP tags as we need, right? But we can also set them up so that they can be on a single line, like in the case of these two sets of PHP tags that I've put in. But I could also, if I wanted to, go back and put them so that they span multiple lines. Maybe, for example, here what I could do is I could use PHP to output a unordered list, let's say. So one set of PHP tags, but multiple echo statements inside of it. There we go. Don't forget my semicolons at the end of the line. PHP statements always end with a semicolon. Something along those lines would be just fine. So PHP tags can be included on the same line like I did up here. PHP tags can include multiple lines like I did down here. Either one works just fine. If I were to jump over to my web browser now and refresh, you can see that everything's rendering out as if it were just plain old HTML. If I look at the actual code that's being generated here, it's not necessarily the prettiest code in the world that PHP is outputting, but it is still fundamentally valid. We'll talk about that more here in a little bit. You can see that this is a test break that's actually being output there. You can see my short tags showing up there. The reason the short tags are actually showing up is because my server here is not actually configured to allow them, so they're just being output as if they were regular text. And then here's my unordered list with 2 list items inside it that's being output. Since my short tags are not actually being recognized by my server, I am going to go ahead and just remove them here for the moment. As we're going through and we're actually putting in our PHP tags, besides the different styles of PHP tags, besides the fact that they can be single line or multiple line PHP tags, we also have the option of putting PHP tags in any part of our PHP script that we happen to need. Here at the moment, I'm actually putting my PHP tags inside the body so that we're more easily able to actually see the output that our PHP echo statements are producing. But as we go through and we learn to do more and more things with PHP, we will expand the range of where we end up putting these PHP tags. I could, for example, have a set of PHP tags that I put up in the head section. Maybe I have a bit of embedded CSS that I've put up here in the head section. And perhaps I would like to, let's say, do a little bit of styling on that unordered list. For that unordered list, maybe I'm going to give it a background color. And it would, of course, be easy enough to simply put in my color gray. Oh, there we are. All right, so I've got a gray background on that unordered list. In the future, though, if we were to come across a situation where we maybe wanted to dynamically assign the background color to that unordered list, there may be a benefit at that point of actually having PHP tags here outputting the actual color for the background. In that particular case, what I could do is instead of hard coding in the color gray, I could actually put a PHP statement here. In this case, it's not very interesting. It's just going to be a PHP statement that echoes out the color gray. So in essence, it ends up being the same as if I had just typed gray there, hard-coded the color gray there. But by being able to have PHP here in the head section of my document, it does open up the possibility in the future of being able to do things like dynamically select a background color. You see it works just the same way. We can even have PHP tags in places where in a normal HTML file you typically don't think about any code going. For example, before the actual doc type and open HTML tag up at the top of our document, it's not at all uncommon in PHP for us to actually do some PHP processing before the HTML part of the file actually begins. In this particular case, I'm not going to put anything there. I'll just leave the PHP tags there sort of as a reference or as a reminder that it's possible. But in the future, that's actually one of the places where we'll end up doing quite a bit of our PHP work before the opening doc type of the HTML document itself. We even have the option, if we happen to want it, to be able to put PHP tags inside the HTML tags. So here in the opening body tag for my document, if I wanted to, say, do some inline CSS, maybe another background color, for example. I could say style equals background color red there, and that of course is going to give me a red background. Wow, that's bright. And just like I did with the embedded CSS up in the head section, if circumstances in the future were to make it advantageous for us to be able to determine what color was actually going to be output here with PHP, I could actually put PHP code right there inside the CSS, inside the attribute of an HTML tag. So quite a little bit of an embed that's actually sort of taking place. So again, if I say a red, or maybe here actually I'll change that to yellow, we'll burn our eyes with a different bright color. There we go. You can see that works just fine as well. So literally anywhere in a HTML file, we have the ability to put in any of our different types of PHP tags that we're configured to use, and we can have PHP do any work for us that may need to be done in any of those different positions, in any of those different parts of the document. Now, of course, at the moment, this all probably seems silly, and I can't say actually that it's not, because here what we're doing with PHP, where we're simply echoing out things that we could have just as easily or more easily just typed ourselves, this is a fairly silly thing to do at this point. But in the future, as we learn more about PHP and we learn to have things like conditional statements where PHP makes decisions, do this or do this other thing based on some condition, when we learn to have PHP interact with our requests and responses, when we learn a lot of the other capabilities that PHP has, having PHP in all these different parts of our documents will stop being such a silly thing and will actually become something that's extremely powerful, extremely useful for us to be able to do. But since we're kind of here at the very beginning and we're just learning the absolute basics at this point, we are going to start off here and with a few others with what you might call stupid examples, which is really what quite a few of these beginning scripts will be. But they will build into something as we move forward. So that is the basic rundown on PHP tags. They come in the regular and the short form. Short form is not advised to use because there's a good chance that you'll run into situations where they won't be allowed. The regular form of PHP tag is typically best. When we're writing our PHP tags, they can be written on a single line or they can span multiple lines. When we are writing our PHP tags, we have the ability to insert them into any part of the document and in any number that the situation happens to call for. So we can have as few or as many PHP tags anywhere in our files as we might happen to need. The next thing I want to talk about in this short video is I wanted to talk a little bit about PHP comments. Just like HTML has its own style of comment, CSS has its own style of comment, JavaScript has its own, PHP of course also has a form of comment or multiple forms of comments that we can use as a type of documentation. PHP comments, let me throw some in here to demonstrate them for you, come in a few different varieties. One of the most common type is the single line C style PHP comment, which is basically 2 / symbols, followed by whatever you want the comment to be. The way this actually works is anytime the PHP compiler sees 2 /, it assumes that everything from that point until the end of that line is a comment, and the compiler will ignore all of that material. So here in this case, where I have 2 / at the beginning of the line and then nothing else on it but my comment, that entire line, as far as PHP is concerned, essentially doesn't exist. It's not going to react to it or do anything with it. We can also use those single line comments to add comments to the end of lines that otherwise would do something. So here on my echo statement where I start my unordered list, I could say this is the starting UL. In that particular case, PHP will go ahead and recognize and execute the echo statement at the beginning, but once it reaches the double / it will again then assume that everything from that point to the end of the line is a comment and will not react to it at all. Single line comments in PHP can also be created by using the #, same basic idea. The # in place of the double / acts as a single line comment. This is also a single line comment. It can be included at the end of other lines, so I could put one here. This is the ending UL. And just like with the double / PHP will ignore everything from the # until the end of the line. So functionally, the # and the double / are equivalent. They are exactly the same thing. It's just two different styles of writing depending on which one you prefer. There is one other type of comment that's fairly commonly used in PHP, and that is the multi-line comment. The multi-line comment starts with /* and ends with */. Something like the double forward slash, if you've done any work in C or C++, you're probably already familiar with this style of comment. In PHP, this is called a block comment. And essentially, it's, again, a comment. It gives us a way to be able to insert content into our PHP code, but to do it in such a way that the PHP compiler will actually ignore it. The advantage of the block comment is that it can be multiple lines long. This can be more than one line long. We could do the same basic comment using the single line comments if we wanted to, but we would have needed to put the double forward slash or the pound sign in front of all 5 of these lines, depending on how you count it. With the block comment symbols, we're able to just put the opening and at the beginning, the closing at the end, and then write as much content between them as we want without having to worry about any other special symbols being put in. So that's the third type of comment that we can put into PHP. If I jump over to my browser at that point and refresh, right, if I actually take a look at the code that is being generated by the PHP server and sent to my browser, this is what I get. It's essentially the same thing that we saw previously when we looked at this, but if you notice, if you go looking for the comments, none of them are actually there. Like I said, the PHP server ignores those comments as if they didn't actually exist. That means that they are never in any way translated into output that gets sent into the web browser. So anything that you happen to put into PHP in the form of comments never actually makes it to the output, never actually makes it to the web browser. So PHP comments are really just there for the developer. The only people who will ever see the PHP comments are the people who are actually seeing the PHP code, which is never going to include the end user. The end user should never see the content of your PHP comments. If you compare that to regular HTML comments, if I come outside my PHP tags here and put in a regular HTML comment, when I go to the browser, refresh, and take a look at the downloaded code, you can see that the HTML comment is present. So anything put into HTML comments is potentially viewable by the user. Anything put into PHP comments is not. This difference between HTML and PHP comments is also important in that you have to remember that a comment is not just a comment. The appropriate type of comment has to be used in the right place in the file. If we were to put a HTML comment inside a set of PHP tags, it would be considered an error because an HTML comment is not recognized inside PHP. Similar to that, if we were to use a PHP comment outside of a set of PHP tags in the regular HTML part of the document, for example, if I were to say here in the HTML part outside the PHP tags, this is a PHP comment, when I actually went and looked at that in my browser, I would actually see that comment show up. Because, of course, in the HTML part of the document, PHP comments are no longer recognized as being comments. Hopefully kind of goes without saying that HTML comments belong in the HTML parts of your document and PHP comments belong in the PHP part of your document. The two cannot really be mixed. The last thing I want to talk about here then is validation. When you've worked on PHP, CSS in the past, you may have gotten used to using the W3C's HTML validator as a way to be able to determine if the code you had written is correct. Here in my browser, if I were to go to validator.w3.org, right, this is the W3C's validator, of course. And here in the validator, you may have in the past gotten used to being able to go and upload your HTML files so that it could then give you feedback on whether you had made any mistakes when you were actually writing your HTML code. Since we're now working in PHP, this option doesn't really work for us anymore. If we were to actually select a PHP file and upload it, we would get back many, many validation errors. And the reason for that is not necessarily that there's anything wrong with our HTML. The problem is that the HTML validator does not recognize, does not understand PHP code. So when we're working with PHP and we want to do validation to check ourselves and make sure we're doing things correctly as far as the HTML is concerned, what we actually need to do is use from the validator this third option, validate by direct input. What this will allow us to do is to actually copy and paste the output from our PHP's execution so that we can then have that output validated. Here's the way it would work. If I come back over to my tag example, go take a look at the source code that was generated by my PHP's execution. If I were to copy that, take it to the validation service and paste it in, and then ask it to check that code, we could get a real sense at that point of whether our HTML code is correct or not. And you can see here it tells me my document was successfully checked as being HTML5. There are 2 warnings. Those 2 warnings are warnings you always get when you're doing HTML5 validation in this way. They are simply saying, first of all, that the HTML5 conformance checker is an experimental feature. It's kind of still in beta in a way. And the other warning we get is that it cannot guarantee that our file is actually in UTF-8 character encoding. It's not actually using that character encoding. Since we didn't actually upload the file but instead just pasted and copied in some code, it doesn't actually know anything about the original file that that code came from, so this is a guarantee that the validator can't make. So when we do want to do this validation with PHP, this is the way that it needs to be done. It's a very handy tool still. You just have to remember that it's done slightly differently, in a slightly different way than it's done when you're working with a pure static HTML file. Because of course here we're needing to bypass the fact that the validator doesn't recognize PHP code. Really the only thing there is for us to validate as far as HTML is concerned is the output from the execution of our PHP code, and this is the way that we actually do that.